right, good afternoon, everyone. It's 1 o'clock by my watch, so we're going to go ahead and get started. And I believe there are still people that are coming in, but we're going to start with the typical housekeeping and rules before we hand over the podium to our speaker today, John Gerwin. So good afternoon again, and welcome to our National Pollinator Week webinar series. My name is Gabriella Garrison, and I am the Eastern Piedmont Habitat Conservation Coordinator for the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, and I'm also the coordinator for this group, the North Carolina Pollinator Conservation Alliance. We're so happy to have you today, and folks that were here yesterday, we're happy to have you back. We are, of course, celebrating National Pollinator Week, an annual event that is actually celebrated internationally to honor pollinator health, awareness, and conservation. So yesterday, we spoke with Dr. Elsa Youngstead about carpenter bees, and today we're going to hear from John Gerwin, who's going to chat with us about butterflies with just a sprinkling of moths. So before we start, let's just go over our basic rules. Your microphones have been muted, so please keep them muted, and also turn off your camera if you would to minimize distraction to our speaker. We will have plenty of opportunity at the end of the talk to have questions and answers. So if you have a question during the presentation, please drop it in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. And then we always get the question if the webinar is going to be recorded, and it absolutely yes will be recorded, and we'll post it on our YouTube channel within the next several days. And I'll send out an email via Eventbrite to let everyone know when those recordings have been posted. So keep an eye on your email. So just a really quick summary of this group, the North Carolina Pollinator Conservation Alliance. We are a partnership of over 25 agencies and organizations with interest in pollinator outreach and conservation. We are government agencies, nonprofits, utilities, private organizations, just a really diverse group of people. And within this partnership, we have 6 committees: the plant resources, habitat assessment, research, energy, and pesticide stewardship. And then of course, our outreach committee, who is responsible for bringing you this series of webinars this week. And if you'd like to learn more about our group, we have a website, ncpollinatoralliance.org. And we're also on most social media outlets, including Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. This is just a listing of some of our partners so you can see the diversity. We're so fortunate to have such a vast array of knowledge. And then just a really quick reminder, we have one more webinar coming up tomorrow, same time, 1 o'clock. And Lenny Lampel from the Mecklenburg County Parks and Recreation Department is going to be talking to us about beneficial insects in the environment. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to let John start sharing his screen. And while he's doing that, I'm going to give you a quick background and information on John. He is the research curator in ornithology, and he does education. He likes to call it Nature-ology with the NC Museum of Natural Sciences. His fate in graduate school was torn. Was it going to be birds or was it going to be butterflies? And so he chose birds as his career and Lepidopterans, which we know as butterflies and moths, as his hobby. He oversees the research collection of dead birds at the museum and studies the breeding biology of select live ones across the state. In his copious spare time, he chases Lepidoptera and other pollinators around his neighborhood with his dog and his camera, and he's participated in the Raleigh area annual butterfly count for 15 years. So with that, John, I'm going to hand over the podium, and the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. All right, I'm going to go ahead and run through a bunch of slides with the information about butterflies and moths, mostly from my yard neighborhood. I try to relate it to parts nearby. Butterflies, of course, and moths are pretty popular for going out and trying to find and observe, take a look at. And so we'll talk about ways that that we can do that, ways that we can attract them. I'm going to mention some of the things I do in my yard, some of the challenges of being in an urban yard and attracting butterflies and moths, and also just some of the ways you can go about studying them in the yard. I use a simple point and shoot camera, by the way, every now and then my smartphone, but mostly it's just a simple point and shoot, and then I edit the photos afterwards on my computer. And so you can do a lot with just a little bit of gear. Yeah, as I said, a lot of us like to watch butterflies, even my canine companions, and we'll talk about different ways to do that. One thing to consider when you're looking at these these critters is the entire life cycle. So the butterflies and moths are going to come in, lay an egg. So we're looking for the right habitat for egg laying, and that's going to be the host plant. Then the caterpillars grow up, so they need the host. You need a host food, but then there's maybe cover that they need for doing the pupal form, and then they emerge as an adult. Now they need a different food source. And so when we talk about foods for Lepidoptera, we're talking about food in two different life stages, and they're going to be very different since they have different ways of feeding. If you haven't seen the adult up close or a different point of view, here's the proboscis of a swallowtail. It's a pretty neat adaptation for the adults to get the nectar. And we'll look at behavior. I'll just mention some behaviors. One of the things I like to look for in my yard is when I see a butterfly doing this, it's obviously out of focus because it's moving, it's dancing on that leaf, and the arrow is pointing at her front feet. So the butterflies have chemical reception in their front feet. That's how they taste the plant. And what she's looking for is to try and determine, is that really the host plant that I want to lay my egg on? Is that, and we know monarchs feed on milkweed, so she's trying to determine, is that really a milkweed? We can see from the pods on the upper right that is a milkweed, and she came to the same conclusion later on in the day and laid some eggs on that plant. But I look for butterflies doing this sort of erratic behavior where they're kind of, it looks like their feet are touching something really hot, and they can't stand still, and they're bouncing and bouncing. And that's what they're doing. They're touching the plant, looking for the host plant. So if you see that, you can follow them around, and generally you'll find, you'll discover what they've found and where they've laid an egg. Another thing to consider is seasonality. For some butterflies in our area, it's pretty broad, and in others, it's pretty brief. This is a juniper hair streak. I've only seen a few in North Carolina. It's not the most common. It's not the most rare, but it doesn't have a long flight time. So here's an adult feeding on a rattlesnake master, which is not really a common native plant. They're around. Not the most common. The larvae feed on juniper. That's where it gets its name from, or it's red cedar. But the other thing is that they only fly for a couple of months, the adults. They're only out there in July and August. So if you want to see a juniper hair streak, you need to be out during the hottest part of the year looking around, which may explain why I don't see very many, because I'm not out looking in old meadows with juniper trees in July and August. I use a lot of containers in my yard. Again, I'm in an urban area. Small yard, bigger than most, but still small, and limited sunlight. So I use the containers to take advantage of the patches of sun that I have. And then I use beds as well. It's difficult digging in the clay. It doesn't take much to attract a lot of pollinators. I also do a bee wasp talk on all the things I've attracted to, all the Hymenoptera that have come into the yard. I've had I'm now up to over 40 species of butterflies in the yard. When we moved here, it was just grass and English ivy. And we've converted it to a lot of this. And it's been pretty neat to see a lot of wasp bees, as well as even dragonflies that come in. So this is our yard from overhead. So this is us. You can see it's pretty shaded, but there's a couple patches of sun here, a couple patches here. And our neighbors now, our new neighbors here, are converted all this into a little meadow with native plants. It's pretty cool. So we're helping each other out that way. But the sun comes in at different angles too. So if you've got a property to consider where you're working under, there's actually a fair amount of light gets through the canopy, more than we think. And a lot of plants are more tolerant than we think. So the moral of the story is, try things out. If you're not sure, it's really not that expensive to try different plants and see what happens. And then it's a bit of a blasphemy, but I use non-natives as well as natives. I'm actually more concerned with invasive versus non-invasive. And there are some native plants that I'll talk about later that are pretty invasive, and it depends on the situation. But also things like lantana, they're not going anywhere. If you put a lantana in the ground, I tend to kill them. But my neighbors have lantana, and they've had the same lantana little bush by their mailbox for 15 years. They don't spread. So you have to know your plants, know which ones to work with if you're going to do some non-natives. There's a lot of good ones that have nectar, but I mostly do natives. And when it comes to native plants, I'll show some examples of things later. We'll just discuss some of the ones that I like, but anything in the mountain mint group is just like a drug to pollinators, whether it's a bee or a wasp or a butterfly. These there's Virginia mountain mint, and then there's this one, different one. They're amazing plants, providing nectar and pollen for these critters. And then consider the network. The caterpillars that you're growing can become food for something else. Somebody is food for somebody else somewhere on the chain. It can be a little frustrating though in an urban area where our houses provide a lot of cover for things like these polistes, these paper wasps, and they can get out of hand. So I do manage the paper wasps, but when they're around the house too much, I take them down. I spray them sometimes. It just gets to be too many. They go after my monarchs, especially. That gets me a little cranky. And I'll let a few paper wasps out in the yard. If they build somewhere down by the street, that's fine. But when they're all over the house and they're all over my milkweed, then something's got to give. But you just have to watch, you have to manage things in that regard. But this is actually a cool paper wasp. I've only seen this species once in the yard. It's not real common. And wouldn't you know, it's eating one of my other caterpillars, but that's how it goes. And then there are things like this, there's a non-native mantid up there, the Chinese mantid, and he's eyeing my adorable little monarch that's chosen to go into the carport and pupate. So I didn't feel like killing the mantid, so I just went ahead and, oh, there he is, getting ready. This was like 11 o'clock at night. Anyway, so I built a little screen for it and made enough room for it to hatch out and spread its wings if I wasn't home, and then just kept an eye on it for the next 12 days, and everything worked out. So we had a big reveal party. It's a male, and we were able to take it out in the front yard and let it go. So I'll get into some of the butterflies, and I'm going to start with one of the groups that confuses most people, the skippers. A lot of them look alike. They're sort of the sparrows of the butterfly world. There are a lot of brown and blotchy ones, but there are a lot that actually look different, and they're colorful, like these two, the fiery skipper on the left and the little tiny leaf skipper on the right. A lot of them feed on grasses, and they're native grasses, but there are also these non-native grasses. So that's the irony of our urban areas, is that you have these things like Kentucky bluegrass and Bermuda grass and centipede grass, and these skippers, to them, grass is a grass. So they're happy the larvae will feed on on these different grasses. I got a kick out of this one because this is more of a wetland skipper. Marshy areas along maybe streams or canals. And one year they showed up in my yard, and I couldn't understand why this little guy was there. We have a lake across the street, but not a lot of marsh around it. And anyway, they showed up, they visited the marigolds, but I thought, what is it doing there? It's not a very strong flyer. And then, well, I decided to, I better read up on it. So I did. And here's what some of the larvae feed on. And I remembered that one of my colleagues at the museum had given me some cultivated wild rice in a pot. And I have a little pond out front, a little 5-foot pond. And I just stuck that pot in the pond, and that rice grew up. And it was about 5 or 6 feet tall now. And sure enough, these little guys had found those little rice plants in the pond. I don't know how they do it. They have this amazing ability to find the plants that we put in. So it's a classic case of if you build it, they will come. The sachem skipper is a common one all over the place. And this just points out that males and females look different. So it's bad enough that they can be rather just different shades of brown. And then you have males and females that look different. They look like different species, but in fact, they're one. So female on the right, male on the left, but they're part of the system. Some of the larger skippers that are out there, like silver spotted skipper, a lot of people know. They don't feed on grasses. They're feeding on legumes. And they also nectar commonly at various plants in the garden. The New York ironweed is one of my favorite plants. And so I get a lot of pollinators at that plant when it's in flower. And then another large skipper, there's a group of skippers called dusky wings. They do look alike. There's some real subtle differences. If you get a good photo and you use iNaturalist, you can usually the computer vision on iNat will get you to the right one, or at least the right one or two, and then you can investigate. But these guys feed on plants in the genus Baptisia. This is a native plant. There are different species around. They're very drought tolerant. So I've got just 3 plants in the yard of wild indigo, and lo and behold, a couple of years ago, I saw one of these flying around the driveway, and I thought she must be looking for one of my plants. And then I went back out a couple weeks later and I looked for skipper homes, which is what the larval skipper does, is they make a little tent here. So they pull the leaves over, they cut the leaf, pull over, and here you can see a little thread. They've sewn it together, and that's how they hang out during the day. Typically they come out at night to feed, but anyway, I peeled one back and there it was, a cute little wild indigo dusky wing larval. Now here's a horse's dusky wing, and again, the males and females are different, like the other one I showed, the sachem. And the other thing is that these butterflies, you know, they all wear and tear during their flights. They might fly 4 to 6 weeks, and by the 5th week, they're looking pretty wrung out. They just keep that in mind. Here's another one that looks pretty good. The common checkered skipper. And again, this one has learned to feed on some of the non-natives around. So we have native mallows, but there's that non-native one, the Eurasian one, that gets all over our yards and all over roadsides and any disturbed area. And that's one of the larval host plants for the common checkered skipper. So they're in that plant is in my yard, and I don't, you know, try to dig it up or use chemical to get rid of it. I just let it go. There's not much grass left in our yards. I've converted most of it, so a few mallow plants are no big deal. But there are some natives around that they also feed on. It's a neat little skipper. Most of the time, these skippers land with their wings open like this if they're one group of skipper, and then the other groups land with their wings folded. This one will do both. So here's one. Here's what I mean. Typically, they land folded up like this or like this one. This female here and this individual here, they're just trying to get some sun. On the left is a clouded skipper, and on the right is Zabulon. And again, these are ones that will feed on various grasses, including native. And I grow some native things in the yard, some different kind, 4 or 5 different kinds of native grasses that I grow. And here, this thing is pretty neat. The orange and brown is pretty dramatic one, like the fiery skipper. It's pretty beautiful. And then the female is dramatically different. And ironically, she looks a bit like a clouded skipper, which both sexes look like this. So sometimes, you know, there's a case where it can be a little confusing. She's got this white rim on the hind wing. You can read up about all this stuff, you know, online, different sources I'll mention at the end. If you're fortunate, you can find some that are copulating. In this case, it's if this were Zabulon, this guy would be really orange, but they're both the same. So I know they're clouded skippers. And just keep an eye on the antenna, or notice the antenna here, the narrow and the club and the hook, especially the club end. I'll come back to that at the end when we talk about moths and butterflies. One last skipper is the long-tailed skipper. This is a tropical species to me. I've worked in the tropics a lot. There are numerous species of long-tailed skippers, and in the southeast we get this one, and they're common in Florida, Georgia, abundant in the Gulf Coast. And what they do is they're kind of like the monarch. There's a number of butterflies that do this. They will have early broods, and then those subsequent broods push north. So they push into North Georgia, South Carolina, and then ultimately they will reach North Carolina later in the summer. This is not a real common one, but we do tend to see them regularly in the Piedmont, starting, say, in mid to late July and then through August. So it's an interesting pattern we see in several species of butterflies that do that. I've only seen this once in my yard. It was an amazing find. It was during the pandemic, and I suspect they've been out there more frequently, but I was home more frequently, and I was out in the garden more frequently during that time. So I happened upon it. So it was really pretty. It just hatched out somewhere. You can see it's still pretty fuzzy back here. This fuzz will wear off in short order, probably in a week or so. This will be gone. So one of our, we'll get away from the skippers into the more typical butterflies. Here's one called the snout, or the American snout, or snout butterfly. And this is why you can see this extension to where it's, I guess the palps are, the pedipalps. And here's a worn individual, and I point this out. This is what I mean about how they can get pretty worn. But this is a case where some adults of some species overwinter in our area, but then they'll come out on a warm winter day. So this was January when I took this picture. And the other interesting thing was, just a year before, I had planted a hackberry sapling. It was about 4 feet tall. So I mean, it was a real tree or a real sapling. And and it was growing, doing well. Of course, it's winter now, and no leaves on it, but darn if this thing didn't show up, and it was sitting right next to that hackberry sapling out in the front yard. And that's what the larvae feed on. And I don't know, maybe that adult had been in the yard during the summer when the tree was leafed out. But I just find it amazing because over and over, this is what I see when I plant things in the yard. A year or two later, the host or the target butterfly will show up. They really have a way of finding things. So here's another one. You can guess by the name what the larvae feed on. There are two species that are similar looking, but this is the hackberry emperor. Here, the young caterpillars will feed communally, and then they overwinter in groups that are gathered in rolled up dead leaves. So the other thing I do in the yard is I leave dead leaves that are either suspended when they fall or on the ground. I have a lot of piles of leaves out in the yard. There's another butterfly we're going to see in a minute where the larvae feed on dead leaves. And then here's a case where maybe I shouldn't have shown this one because it's not pollinating, it's not doing its job. It's the adults feed on dung and sap and rotting fruit. Although I guess if anything feeds on dung, we'll give them extra credit. There are, we know about cabbage white, the non-native, and it can be a real agricultural pest. Many people don't know that we have native whites in the area, and this is one of them called the checkered white. They feed on the larvae feed on mustard, plants in the mustard group. There are two species of butterflies that we call ladies. There's an American lady and a painted lady. The American lady used to be called the American painted lady. It was very confusing to try to keep it all straight. Somebody finally had the good idea to just drop painted from the name of this one. It's just American lady. And this one has the two spots on the hind wing. The larvae feed on these plants, including asters and thistles, artemisia. Here's what one of them looks like. And the adults are fond of asters, goldenrods, and milkweeds. The other one looks similar, and I'll show you a shot here in just a second, but here's a close-up of the underside. They typically perch like this, and you can see the eye spots. And then here's the painted lady, and they have multiple 4 to 5 eye spots underneath. The upper side's a little different. It can be hard to see the differences. I always look for this. This is the most widely distributed butterfly in the world. It's on every continent except maybe Australia. I know it's not on Antarctica, but I don't think it's Australia, but it's everywhere else. And I've seen it in a lot of different countries where I've worked. And so it does something like the monarch, where these guys start breeding early in the year and subsequent broods push north, push north, push north. And then we start seeing them later in the summer. I noted for years that I would not see many of these until late July and August, and I often wondered. And then again, I finally thought I should learn something about them, and I went online to read up a few years ago and discovered that in fact this is their breeding behavior, and this is why I tend not to see very many of them until later in the season. Once again, this one just has hatched out. You can see it pretty fuzzy on the back here. Both of these species, the adults will hibernate in our area, so we often see them come out again on a warm winter day. And this may explain why this species is so widely distributed, because the larvae are been documented feeding on 100 different kinds of plants. The adults prefer to feed on different kinds of composites like this one's doing here. And then, so, take a moment, mention some of the plants that I like. So I already mentioned the New York ironweed. I like purple, but so I have a lot of purple plants in the yard, but I really like the ironweed just as a nectar and pollen plant for both butterflies, bees, and wasps, and different flies even. It's a really fun one to have around. Here's Joe Pyeweed, also a great one. It likes to have its feet wet, so they take a little more effort, which I have some in the yard that I can water by hand and keep them going. And then I like the blue mist. These guys obviously are in a drought time a couple of years ago, but it's changed names now. Like what I think they're on the 3rd genus, but I call it ageratum still, or the blue mist flower. A lot of small butterflies nectar at this late in the summer and the fall. It's a great one to have around. And then I almost hesitate to mention these two, but here's the verbena. It's not native. It reseeds as an annual, and some people find it pretty aggressive, invasive. I have found it not to be the case. In fact, all of mine have died out. I let some grow in the between the bricks in our patio, and some butterflies and bees really like it. So I just kept it going for a while, but they finally just died out. And then this is native. This is a passion flower. I really like it. So do the carpenter bees. So do some butterflies. But I tell you, this thing goes crazy in the yard. And my wife always drags me out every spring and says, all right, which ones live and which ones die? Because we are not going to let all of them live. They will take over. And so you do have to manage them. But they're really fun to have around. Sometimes I come outside, there'll be four carpenter bees all crammed into this thing. Here's the New York ironweed. When it's been in the yard for a few years, it gets up to 9 feet tall. If you let it. You can cut these things back, of course, while they're growing. Say, and like now in June, right now my ironweeds are only about this tall, but in July I could cut it a bit back, and then when it wouldn't get so tall. But I let them go. And then I like native sunflowers a lot. I like yellow as well. And the few that I've had success with are these two have been real magnets for pollinators. So smooth oxeye and one called green-headed sneezeweed or green-headed coneflower. I will tell you that both of them are pretty aggressive for a native plant. And that's partly because, get them out of their element, which is my yard, and they reseed and they just sprout everywhere. So I'm forever pulling volunteers up and tossing them. It's something else and they can outcompete some other plants. So a little bit of management, but they're worth it because they really attract a lot of things. I like swamp sunflower. It also gets like the ironweed. It gets about 8-9 feet tall. I don't get as many butterflies at swamp sunflower. I get more flies and wasps late, and they don't flower till late in the season, like late September, October. But it's a fun one to have for the late dwelling arthropods out there. And cup plant is another fantastic one for pollinators. A lot of bees, wasps, flies get to it, as well as butterflies, especially the swallowtails. They're all over. When this cup plant comes out in a few weeks, it's just full of swallowtails and some of the skippers. Some shrubs and other forbs that I like. The shrubs, I really like New Jersey tea, common button bush. If you can keep it wet and sunny, that's what it likes. And so I grow it in a pot so I can keep it wet. And then sweet pepper bush, which actually is in the shade more, but the swallowtail love the flowers of sweet pepper bush. And again, I'm referring to nectarine things here. And then some more purple. I love summer phlox and liatris if I can keep it growing, and a few others that the butterflies love the nectar at. So switching back to some butterflies, here's a common buckeye, native common buckeye on a non-native zinnia. Again, these are things that you can grow in a pot and they won't spread, and they provide nectar and especially in an urban setting. It's a beautiful butterfly. They vary on the top side. Some are dark, some are more just medium brown. Underneath they vary also. Some get more reddish brown, and that's a seasonal thing. And I forget which is which, but in the winter or the second brood or third brood of the year, when you get into the fall, that one is one color and more colorful than the other. These guys are pretty aggressive when they're in your yard. They chase all kinds of things. They chase other butterflies, and they'll chase bees. They'll chase you if you walk too close. They're pretty fun to have around. And they're feeding on a variety of plants, including plantain, which is not native, but Raleigh is a fun one to have around, which some people consider kind of a weed, which is too bad because I think it's called wild petunia. It's another purple one, and they set seed. I have 100 of them out in the yard right now flowering. I'm glad to have them around. There are some native snapdragons as well as non-native and in mimulus. But there's the caterpillar, spiky little thing. Red admiral, I think everybody knows an adult red admiral when they see one. You might not know the larva. It's another spiky one. They're larvae, they're host plants, so they're a little more restricted to some nettles and false nettles. If you have a wet area and you can tolerate having nettles around, especially if you're not walking in that area very much, then you'll get some butterflies like the red admiral to come in. The next two are what I call ones with good punctuation, and they also feed on nettles as well as some trees. So the question mark is one, and the next one is the one called the comma. And I'll show you both. So here's where it gets its name. It's got a semicircle with a dot underneath it. Obviously, if we were on the other side, it would look more like a question mark. There are two forms. Again, it's a seasonal thing. One is, I think the summer is dark, and then the fall, winter, it's uniform. And the question mark, the adult legs on a non-host. So it's a tough way to start life as a baby, as a young caterpillar, but you got to go find your host plants. So, but apparently they know what they're doing because there are lots of question marks around. So again, they'll be on nettles as well as elms and hackberry trees. And there's one of the larvae. Hopefully you don't sit on it. Pretty dramatic. And then here's the comma. So again, the variation, the dark hind wing and a uniform hind wing, and then here it is with the little semicircle underneath, but no dot. And again, variation, this one's more reddish brown and this is more gray brown. When they sit on the side of a tree trunk, which they normally do, they perch like this on a tree trunk and they fold their wings up, they blend in really well. It's great camouflage. And they're the adults of both of these species. Like I said, they'll hibernate, and you'll see them come out on some warm winter days at times. And once again, these are guys that are not doing their pollination job because as adults, they're feeding on rotten fruit and sap, but they're fun to have around. Also elms, nettles, but commas larvae will also feed on some of the native hops we have around. And I'll switch to some small. So all those other butterflies are all like, you know, $50 sized, or so they're decent sized butterfly. These tiny ones, more like nickel size or dime size, are the hair streaks and the blues. And there's a couple that I see in my yard all the time. One is the gray hair streak. And in the case of these guys, the hair streaks and the blues, their larvae feed on the flowering parts of plants. In the case of the gray hair streak, it's mallows, legume, and I mentioned the Carolina buckthorn. That's not a common one in captivity, but the Bach Garden was selling some a few years ago, and I got one. It's a shrub, and it's doing well out in the front yard. And then here's the red banded hair streak, another common one in the yard. But here they feed on, the larvae feed on rotting dead leaves. So, you know, anybody can do that. And again, here's one of the blue mist flowers. There's a real good host for a lot of these smaller butterflies that I see out there. The blues, even tinier, there's several in the area, and you seldom see the blue because they're typically perched like this with their wings folded, or they fly by and you see this splash of blue. Every now and then I come across one that's sunning itself, and I have my camera, pretty exciting. So there's one that's it's a summer azure. The eastern tail blue here on the left, you can see the little tails. And once again, the larvae are feeding on the flower parts and the seeds of the plants, not on the leaves, but on the flower parts. And it's the same with the spring and summer azure. They're not on legumes, they're on these little shrubs and trees. So for example, dogwoods in my yard. I'll show you a picture of one here next of one of the azures laying eggs on the dogwood. They used to be considered one species. Now people think they're two species, but it's kind of confusing. And I think people are still debating on whether one or two, but I just refer to most of them as summer azure. And here's an eastern tail blue that I happened upon at our study site, the URs, a couple of years ago, and I couldn't believe it sunning itself. And I got a great photo because I don't normally see them like this. And again, they're usually folded up. And the females, if she were folded, unfolded like this, she's more brown gray for all the species, more brown gray, not the blue. So here's the azure. So earlier this spring, I noticed one doing the little dance that I was telling you about. She was out there bouncing around on some leaves, and I thought, she's testing the leaf to see. She's testing these things to see, is this the host plant that I want? So I grabbed my camera and went out and followed her around, and sure enough, she's laying eggs. This is a swamp dogwood. I know that my other slide said flowering dogwood. I suspect that things get replicated on the internet. But here's a swamp dogwood that she laid on, and here I was able to poke around into the flower cluster and find the egg. You can maybe see it, maybe not, but there it is, a little egg right there. Pretty fun to see, fun to find these little things. Keeps me busy, keeps me off the streets at night. So monarch, again, I don't want to, say too much because so much has been said about the monarchs. We do a lot to try to help them out, but I will comment a little bit on milkweed again. The tuberosa, which is the butterfly weed, I find it to be better as a flowering plant. It's a great nectar plant for pollinators. In my yard anyway, the monarchs do not care to lay eggs on it. Other people have told me that in their yard, sometimes they do. But when I have monarchs in the yard, they much prefer common milkweed and swamp milkweed. So I've recently gotten some swamp milkweed from Gabrielle, from a fellow she's working with to grow milkweeds and get them out to different people to test them and see what the monarchs are doing. But swamps like to be wet and sunny, so I keep them in pots where I can keep them in the sun and keep them well watered. But that's where I find that the monarchs really prefer to be. And both of them, whether it's the common swamp or butterfly weed, are full of different pollinators, full of bees and wasps and flies. And there's a monarch egg. Again, it's really fun to go out and find these things. I need to get one of those adapters for my smartphone, a little microscope adapter thing to get even a better photo. I know I can see them on the internet, but it's more fun to go out and find my own. And then there's the aphids. I don't worry too much. Some years I get a lot, like I did this one year that I took this photo. Other years I don't get very many, and I don't know I don't know what's eating them when I don't have very many out there. I get as many milkweed bugs and beetles as I do aphids some years. So I don't, things seem to work out. Everybody seems to have enough food, including the monarchs when they show up. So I'm going to switch to swallowtail, back to some big butterflies. I have at least 5 that have shown up in the yard, 4 or 5. So I'll run through those, and one that I keep trying to attract. I haven't seen it yet. I've seen it nearby. This is the black swallowtail. And this is a young larva. So young caterpillars we refer to as instars. This is one that's like in its second, maybe third instar. When it molts, it sheds its skin. And so eventually it's going to get this real colorful one, which looks a little bit, like a monarch caterpillar. So here's one that's just shed its skin. And now it's got this more colorful pattern to it. They also have the blacks have this little glands that stick out, the osmeteria, to thwart any would-be predator or pesky naturalist trying to photograph it. And they love fennel, parsley. Probably a lot of you have grown fennel and dill and parsley in your yard and had the black swallowtail show up. They feed on some native plants that are in this group, like golden alexanders, or non-native ones like Queen Anne's lace out in the meadow. But in my yard, even though I have golden alexander, they ignore it. And if I have fennel or dark parsley, that's what they go for. The spicebush swallowtail is another one that you see across the state, and I get it in the yard pretty well. Here's some eggs again. And here's one of those early instars. Here's what they look like when they're young. I find that they prefer sassafras more than they do spicebush. I have both in the yard, and they always lay on the sassafras. I don't find them on my spicebush bushes. And then when these guys molt, grow up a little bit, they look pretty cool. These wild little monsters for their last couple of instars before they pupate. The pipevine swallowtail, this is more of a mountain swallowtail, but they have really spread across the Piedmont. I've even seen a few in the coastal plain now. And I think it's because we plant various species of Dutchman's pipe in our gardens and also in the Arboretum. For example, near me at our NC State Arboretum, they have a large array of Chinese Aristolochia, and they're full of pipevine. And then our Prairie Ridge Station property, the museum manages, is full of the native Dutchman's pipe, and they're always full of pipevine swallowtails. And I'm only a mile from them, so that's probably why ultimately they showed up in my yard. This is actually up in the mountains, copulating. They're 2 different color forms. When I find them on the native Aristolochia, they're black. I'm pretty sure I got this one on the Chinese one. So I guess it has something to do with the chemistry of the 2 plants. But I could be wrong. Maybe they just vary that way all the time. There's the native Dutchman's pipe in the mountains, the one that most people are familiar with. And then there's one that grows in the Piedmont that's more on the ground. It doesn't grow up into the trees and shrubs so much. And it's now in a different genus, but I read a note recently from a colleague that said he's found where some butterflies can actually find the Piedmont one, even though it's scattered and in places like power line right of ways and stuff like that. And these butterflies manage to find it, even and it's on the ground. So there you go. Beautiful butterfly with a dramatic pattern on the hind wing where it stops. Behaviorally, the flight patterns are all different. I can tell black from spicebush from pipevine because they have a different flight pattern. These butterflies never stop moving. They're always fluttering their wings, which is why this is out of focus. Whereas black will often perch still, and the spicebush will alternate between some still and some fluttering. So there's a gradation, but the pipevine never stops. And then here's a chrysalis of a pipevine. The tiger swallowtail, of course, is our state butterfly. It's a good choice. Here's the male on the left, and the female on the right has the wash of blue on them. And again, lots of interest in New York ironweed. We get a lot of dark females in the area. I'd say about 50% are some shade of black. They're different shades. I've got hundreds of photos because I enjoy just taking photos of all different kinds of black female swallowtail, tiger swallowtail that show up in my yard, because they're all different gradations of blue and black. And here's these are actually two different individuals, although the sunlight's hitting this one a little bit more, but some are blacker than others. Anyway, it's pretty neat to see. So you've got these black and yellow organisms, and the pipevine, the Eurystolochia is toxic. So the pipevine is clearly picking up a toxin the way monarchs pick up toxins from Asclepius. But and originally everybody thought that, okay, these guys are all mimicking pipevine. But, you know, over the years, people have started to wonder who's mimicking whom. I'm not sure what the latest is, what the latest conclusion is. There are two types of mimicry you can read about. Maybe you have the Mullerian and the Batesian. But anyway, up north, there are fewer, it's a lower proportion of black tiger female swallowtails because you don't get pipevine swallowtail up north. And so I don't know, again, the final story, but it's interesting pattern. And here's one that came last year too. One of the swamp milkweed that I got from Gabrielle that flowered, and this female showed up. And here's a pair. I like to think of it as a married couple having lunch here in my backyard, a male and female. And this is the only caterpillar I've ever found. And that's probably because the tiger swallowtails feed on a lot of different trees. Trees are tall. I'm not up in the treetops looking for caterpillars. The caterpillars come down when they're ready to pupate, and that's what this one is. He's in a pre-metamorphic phase, and he happened to be crawling across the sidewalk when I was walking up. So I grabbed him and took his picture. But it's the only caterpillar of a tiger I've ever seen. But otherwise, they look a bit like a spice bush, where they're lime green and some spotting on the head. This is the one that I have not yet found in my yard, but I've seen them nearby within a mile and a half. The zebra swallowtails all across the Piedmont coastal plain. The larvae only feed on pawpaw. I have pawpaw in the yard. I have too many pawpaws now in the yard. That's another one to be mindful of. If you plant pawpaw, they spread, the rhizomes, the roots spread, and they spring up all over the place. I did not realize what I was getting into, and now I'm forever cutting off all these little saplings. And I neglected to get a second genetic individual, so I have all the one clone, which means they don't flower. So you have to have two different genetic clones of pawpaw to get them to produce fruit. They do flower. I'm sorry, they flower, but they don't pollinate. So anyway, I've got to go get a different pawpaw so I can at least have some fruit if I can't have a zebra swallowtail. And then there are these sulfurs. There are different species of sulfurs around. This one's called the sleepy orange. And this is why the orange, they're usually perched with their wings folded. So I seldom see this. This one I found dead, so I got a chance to take its picture. They feed on some natives and non-natives. Here's their egg, a neat spindle shape. And here are some larvae. And so they feed on senna, which is native. Cassia is not native. This is a sickle pod. And so one year I got some senna and I put it out there, and they dutifully laid eggs. And what they do is they do similar to what black swallowtail does. They lay too many eggs. Next thing I know, I've got too many caterpillars, not enough food. I'm racing around trying to buy more senna to keep the caterpillars going. So, I mean, sometimes I have to just prune the larvae away just so some of them will live and be able to grow up and pupate. but they're pretty neat looking, little fuzzy things, little green. They blend right into the shade of green of these leaves. And I also have this inset here because these are the seed pods of the senna. When they develop, they are fuzzy and green, and to me they look a lot like the larvae of this sleepy orange. Pretty neat. And then here's what the sennas grow up to be. They grow up to be pretty tall, beautiful yellow flowers. Now I have senna everywhere. They're just the seeding all over the yard, which is kind of funny. Now I'm having to pull them out, but there was a time when I didn't have enough for all the caterpillars. I have more than enough now, but they are pretty neat. And here's another one that feeds on the same plants, another sulfur that feeds on senna and cassia. This is a more tropical one, the cloudless sulfur. Here's another, and again, they sit like this, usually with the wings folded. And then here's one that I found dead, so I got the shot of its open wings. This is a highly migratory one. You will see, by the hundreds and hundreds on our street in September, they are heading west to east. They appear to head to the coast, and then they hit the coastline and head south. And I guess they end up in Florida. I don't know what they do there, but I mean, I don't think they come back. I think they just die. I guess a lot of things go to Florida and die, but yeah, they do this big migration every fall. Here's a close-up of one on the flower buds of the senna, which I thought was interesting. So I did some more reading, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But here is one. They like some of the big red flowers in my yard. I have the red hibiscus, which is more of a coastal plain plant, but they will nectar at that. It's a big butterfly. Again, it's more tropical. If you go to the tropics where I've worked, you'll see half a dozen different species. They're really pretty big, like a couple inches across. Here's one that one day I'm walking down the street with a dog, and this one's doing this little dancing thing, but it's on the ground. And I thought, well, that's not right, because this is just not a butterfly that hangs out on the ground, because most of the plants that's around are, as you saw, are pretty tall. So I took some photos because I had this opportunity. These are very erratic and skittish butterflies. I have a hard time getting pictures. And anyway, this was a chance to get a picture. And when I looked at the photo, I realized this plant. I was like, oh my gosh, it looks like a senna. It's not a senna, but it's in that same group. It's called partridge pea. And lo and behold, yeah, that's another host plant for the larvae of this butterfly. So this female had found these. It's the only yard in our neighborhood that had the partridge pea, and she found them. So here's the wild senna, and here's the flowers, and there is a caterpillar of a cloudless sulfur, which take a good look. But if you haven't seen it, there it is right there. So it's pretty cool. So why is it doing that? Why was that adult before sitting on the flower parts? Because kind of like the blues and the hair streaks, what this guy is doing is he's eating the flowers and not eating the leaves. The sleepy orange is eating the leaves, and the cloudless sulfur is eating the flower parts. So it's tough to be a senna if you've got a bunch of these sulfurs around. So there they are up close. Beautiful things. And some black and orange ones to wind down. The pearl crescent is the more diminutive one, and the larvae on the asters, and the adults do feed at some of the smaller flowers, like the blue mist flower in my yard. And again, here's one that's just old. So again, they get faded as they age. The scales, when they first come out, they're refracting light really well, so the colors are really bright. But then as they age, the things are getting worn. There's another one, black and orange, a little bit larger. And the word fritillary, by the way, is applied to different butterflies that are unrelated, genetically unrelated. But black and orange, I think, with the color, the fritillary, I think, derives from a word used for some plants over in the Mediterranean areas, I recall. And then it was adopted for the butterflies. So, but they're the couple species I'm going to show you that they're not what we call the true fritillary. But anyway, they come in and they're a meadow thing, but somehow one of them found my yard one year because of the passion flower. The larvae feed on passion flower. And I say, if you want to have some, come to my yard and get them, but just, again, be careful, because they're crazy the way they grow. Here's the egg of one. One made it, like I say, and laid some eggs. I managed to be there and see it. And then here's the larva. And it's a beautiful chrysalis. I couldn't believe it. One of my students was over helping me in the yard, and she found this chrysalis in our backyard. It's the only one I've ever seen, but what a beautiful, beautiful chrysalis. So here's another one. It's not a true fritillary. This is another tropical one. It's a Gulf fritillary. Again, like the other butterflies, they start early in the season breeding in, say, Florida and the Gulf Coast, and broods move north during the year. And by late summer, we start seeing them in North Carolina. And again, they feed on passion flowers. So passion flowers are more common in the tropics. Here's an egg. It looks like corn on the cob to me. It looks like this little guy thought the same. He's having a little corn on the cob. They change color as they age before they hatch. And then here's the larva, another spiky little thing. But yeah, I couldn't believe that one female found my backyard with the passion flower and laid some eggs, and I got to watch them grow up. So some resources, and then I'll show you some moths, and then we'll be done. Audubon has put together a neat little website for native plants, which you can search by zip code, and it links to some native plant retailers. This was something spearheaded by us in North Carolina. So the Audubon North Carolina office, working with some of our local chapters. I'm with Wake Audubon, and so we helped compile information that a lot of other agencies had already compiled. My former Wildlife Commission colleague, Mark Johns, had done a lot years ago, and then we just took it and repackaged it. So it's pretty neat. And then there's some good sites you can check, like Butterflies of North Carolina. The North Carolina Parks hosts a website that our colleague Harry LeGrand put together with the help of a few others. That's a great, like, statewide account of things and good photos. Jeff Pippin, my colleague who used to work at Duke, has a nice website with some really great photos. I recently discovered that someone on iNaturalist had put together a project page where they compiled all the butterfly images of all the butterflies in North Carolina, and you can find it. You can search and find those things pretty easily. On a national level, I will use these two sites to get some additional information when I need it. They're pretty good. There's obviously a lot out there, so I've had to wade through some things and just filter down and pick a few that I use. I said I would say a few things about moths, so I'll start with one that people think is not a moth. They often think it's a hummingbird. There are these clearwing moths that show up. This is obviously a diurnal moth. We actually have 3 species around. I think mostly I see snowberry when I can identify them. Sometimes they're a little tricky for me to ID because I don't get a good enough photo. There's some subtle differences in the stripe or something on the underside, but I think most of what I've identified over the years are the snowberry, but there are three that you can see in North Carolina. How do we know if we have a moth? Well, it turns out that all butterflies are moths, but not all moths are butterflies. What do we mean by that? So the butterflies are a genetically cohesive group that derives from the moth group, the overall group. So they, in evolutionary history, the butterflies split from all the others and they form their own group. In other words, from that, ancestry.com way of looking at it, the butterflies derive from moths. So we would say everything's a moth, really. But we think of the diurnal ones, most of the ones that are diurnal as butterflies, but as I just pointed out, there are some diurnal moths. Some other differences, the moths, like in the antenna, they're typically, the moths are more variable, but they are typically feathery and they lack that club that I showed you in that one photo. Butterflies are typically have a thin antenna and a club tip. Just keep in mind that there are always exceptions to all these rules, but they're generalities that mostly work. Moths have a frenulum that couples the forewing and the hind wing. Butterflies do not. Most moths spin a cocoon for metamorphosis. Butterflies do a chrysalis. They have different eye structures. You wouldn't necessarily notice that because you have to dissect them or look a little closer, but they do. And they generally have different resting postures, although, we saw some overlap between, say, skipper butterflies and some of the moths with their open wings. And again, while most of the time butterflies are in the day, we know there are differences because there are day-flying moths here, like the clearwing moths. There are several diurnal moths that fly in the tropics, and they look like swallowtail butterflies. They're really beautiful and iridescent. So again, here's a caterpillar, an adult with a butterfly with the club antenna. The skippers have a little hook often, but it's small. It's a linear and a club. And here's a typical moth, a rosy maple moth, a beautiful North Carolina moth. And typically, especially the males have the more feathery antenna because they're using that to detect chemical hormones that the females give off. So they're when they're looking for a female, that's how they do their looking, is sensing chemicals with that. antenna. Some of the moths in our area, the most dramatic are the silkworm or the silk moths, the Saturniids. So there's the tulip tree silk moth, the spiny oakworm. This is the one in the fall, the caterpillars drop out of the oak trees and are all over our streets and sidewalks. It can be pretty messy. And that's what the adult looks like, spiny oakworm. There's a Polyphemus, the royal walnut. Another one is, where did he go? Oh, there it is, a Luna moth, which I've had a few in the yard over the years. These things feed on a variety of trees, and so they're not rare, but they're spread out, so I don't see them a lot. And then there's the oh Lord, imperial. I've drawn a blank there. I tend to see these. They pupate. When they pupate, they don't come out till late July, August. So when you're looking for these guys, it's late midsummer that you want to look for them. And then here's a smattering of moths that I've seen around. Tulip. I'm forgetting the name again, but it's a common one. The Sphinx moth, the Pandora Sphinx moth. This is a white line Sphinx moth. It's a pretty common one. And this is actually the adult of a woolly bear. Most people just think of the caterpillars, for the woolly bears, and don't realize it's a tiger moth. And then the iron-winged clearwing moth is it's another clearwing moth, which when I first saw it in my yard, I was like, what kind of wasp is that, or a bee? And it took me a while to go back into iNaturalist and get my photo in and figure out that it was an iron-winged clearwing moth. So wouldn't you know, I told you that this is one of my favorite plants, the New York ironweed. It turns out it's one of the favorites of this moth. One year I had a few ironweeds that were dying. They just kept dying. I couldn't figure out why. I was like, there was no reason for an ironweed in my yard to die. And then I found out that what these guys do is they lay eggs and the larvae crawl down and feed on the roots. They feed on the roots of the ironweed. So that's why those plants were dying, but that's okay. I'm happy to have the moth around. It's a cool moth. It's a small one. I think it's only about a quarter size. So when I found it a few years ago, there were only 4 counties that it was known from. But then over the last couple of years, all of a sudden people started finding them and dumping records into iNaturalist. But I sent photos to my colleagues, like Steve Hall, and there's another fellow that he works with that does the moths in North Carolina, and they were happy to get the report because they said, wow, it's the first one we've had for Wake County. But now I go out on iNaturalist and there are dozens and dozens of them. I don't know if that's a result of the pandemic or just people catching up with their data. But anyway, it's a cool find. So that's the end of mine stuff. This is over at Prairie Ridge, but it's been, like I said, it's been great to document all these things in my neighborhood, a lot of them in my yard from planting these different plants, but this is not my yard. I wish it was, but it's not. So if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them if we have any time. And Gabrielle, you want me to stop sharing?
You don't have to. You can leave that up if you'd like. So, yep, so it's 1:58 now, but there are several questions and I'd like to get them answered. So if you need to leave at 2 o'clock, this is being recorded. So you'll be able to see the questions when the recording is posted. But if you have a few extra minutes to stay on with John and I, then we will answer some questions. So let me pull up. So the first question, John, is a single egg laid on a plant, is that the norm for butterflies? And which species lay the most eggs per deposit?
I'm not sure which would lay the most. It's more typical for them to lay 1 egg here and 1 egg there, but some like that hackberry emperor, they lay eggs in a little bit of a cluster. And one I didn't show, which is related, is the morning cloak. They also lay eggs in clusters, which is interesting. But most of these guys are trying to spread it out. I would think that they don't want to end up like the black swallowtail or the little sulfur where they run out of food. So at least in my yard where I'm watching them mostly, it's 1 egg on a leaf and then she'll maybe fly to another leaf. But sometimes it's just 2 or 3 on a plant and then she'll go to another plant. To me, that makes the most sense. So that's what I've seen.
Do you have, just based on what you've seen in your yard, which, just to kind of reiterate everything in your presentation, I really do think that the best way to learn these species is to go out and look for them and try to attract them to your yard. You had so many fantastic photos, and you took all of those photos yourself, right, John?
Right. I think just 2 that I got from colleagues, but the rest are mine, and most of them with a, pretty cheap point and shoot with a zoom lens and a macro adapter. But it's not perfect. But once I download them on the computer, you can edit. It's easy to learn how to edit. I just use the picture viewer software on Windows, but every camera comes with software. Easy to learn how to make them a little sharper, a little more correct color, and it's easy to take 10 pictures of something and then delete the 8 that are bad and keep the 2 that are good. And so that's what I do. But yeah, you don't need a really expensive thing. You can get stuff off eBay now. So cheap, but they're so nice. I've used a Nikon P510. It's an older model. I really like it. I use a Canon SX50. It's really nice. I finally splurged and bought a fancier point and shoot last year, a Panasonic Sonic Lumix, which is a Z1000. And it just gives me more megapixels in the image, but they're all really good. They're all really good.
Okay, so the next question is about painted ladies. Are they found in Maryland?
Oh yeah. Yeah. They're especially the painted lady especially is everywhere. I found it at 12,000 feet in the Andes of Peru and Ecuador. It's an amazing butterfly. But even the American lady, both of them are all up and down the East Coast. And also I encourage you to if you go to any one of those national websites like iNaturalist or the butterfliesandmoths.org, they have some nice maps. And actually they often pull from one another, they share data. But they're neat maps that you can zoom in and see down to the county level, or down to the city level. You can see where people are reporting their butterflies, so you can see. But yeah, they are there.
Okay. And so which butterfly caterpillars have spines that are skin irritants to people?
That's a good one. I certainly handle things all the time, but I haven't. I'm not sure, because I'm not really sure if I know some of the moths can do that. We call it urticating. It's the word they use when the spines can, like little syringes, can give you a little toxin that makes you itch the way nettles do. And I don't know about the butterflies. It's a good one. I mean, I've handled a lot of them, but I always do it carefully when I'm photographing them, so I've never had that problem.
Yeah, it seems like the moth caterpillars tend to be a little bit dicier when it comes to spines.
Yeah.
Yep, and Cindy made a comment, saddleback moth has stinging spines.
The saddleback moth does, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so the next question isn't, it's a little bit of a tangent from butterflies, but can you say anything about the spotted lanternfly? And I can drop a link in the chat too that NC State Extension has put out. I don't believe we have actually made any official spottings in North Carolina, but do you have any thoughts, or do you want to say anything about spotted lanternfly?
Well, I don't know much about it, but we just recently, some of you are probably also on the lunchtime series that the Office of Environmental Education puts out, every Wednesday. I guess they just did one 12, they do it 12 to 1. A week or two ago, they had somebody, I don't know if she was at NC State, somebody gave us talk on that spotted lanternfly and the current status in North Carolina. I was unable to attend, but they also record them. So you should be able to go to the EE website and get that recording. Most of you probably know Lisa Tolley or Marty that works with her. They host that series. It's every Wednesday, and they just had a speaker. I really wanted to listen because I don't think anybody has found one, but I think they're getting closer and closer. So it's nerve-wracking.
Yep, I think you're right. They are getting closer and closer, but I don't believe there's been one yet. I think I just found the link. So let me
Okay.
copy that. Hold on 1 second. I'll copy it and I'm going to drop it in the chat right now. Okay. So of the butterflies of North America, how many are observed in North Carolina? Roughly speaking, I guess maybe that's a hard question.
Yeah, I should get that information. It's it's probably on the Butterflies of North Carolina website. I always forget about.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Lunchtime Discovery Series.
Uh-oh.
I'm your host, Chris Smith, here at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences.
Hang on a second. I wonder, is that me? Oh no, that's the video. That's the spotted lantern fly video. So okay, it got quiet. That's that's Chris introducing the lunchtime series. So yeah, I need to go out and figure out like what's the proportion of North American butterflies. I don't even know how many butterflies are in North America. One of those number games that I know it for birds, but I don't know it for the butterflies.
Okay. Okay, well, that was the last question. So unless anybody else has any last minute questions, thank you so much to John for taking the time to put together that presentation and sharing all of your great photos with us and your knowledge. And if you want to take a moment and drop a note of thanks into the chat, I'm sure John would appreciate that. So I mentioned at the beginning, this webinar was recorded and we will be posting it to our North Carolina Pollinator Conservation Alliance webinar within the next several weeks or several days, excuse me. So by the end of this week, and I will send a note out via Eventbrite when that link is available. So we have one more webinar in our series tomorrow. Lenny Lample from Mecklenburg County Parks and Rec will be talking to us about beneficial insects. So we hope that you join us again for tomorrow. And unless you have any last minute questions, thanks to everybody for joining today. Appreciate that.